Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we journey through the life of Gul'dan, the first orcish warlock and perhaps the most treacherous soul to ever walk the world of Draenor. His is a tale of bitterness transformed into ambition, of weakness forged into terrible power, and of a hunger for greatness that would ultimately doom not one world, but two. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this dark tale unfold before you. Few beings in the history of Azeroth have left such a profound mark of destruction as this single orc. From the corruption of his own people to the opening of the dark portal, from the creation of the first Death Knights to the summoning of demons that would threaten all of existence, Gul'dan's influence stretches across decades and dimensions. His story is one that echoes through the ages, a cautionary tale about the price of power and the depths to which hatred can drive a soul. Before there were fell orcs, before there was a horde, before the dark portal ever tore a hole between worlds, there was a crippled child in a remote village, suffering alone and dreaming of revenge. This is where our story begins. In the harsh and unforgiving landscape of Gorgrond, where jagged peaks scraped the sky and primal forces clashed in endless conflict, a child was born who would one day reshape the destiny of worlds. This child entered the world twisted and broken, his body a mockery of orcish strength. Where other infants cried with powerful lungs and grasped at the world with strong fingers, this one wheezed and struggled, his limbs bent at wrong angles, his spine curved in ways that no shaman's blessing could straighten. The clan that witnessed his birth looked upon him with barely concealed disgust. The orcs were a people who valued strength above all else. Their society was built upon the foundations of martial prowess and physical capability. A warrior who could not fight was no warrior at all. A hunter who could not run was no hunter. And a child who could not even stand straight was considered barely worth the resources required to keep it alive. They gave him no true name at first. Names were earned among the orcs, bestowed upon those who proved their worth through deed and action. This crippled infant had proven nothing except that the spirits had cursed his mother's womb. He was called by mockeries and slurs, words that cut as deeply as any blade might have. The other children learned early that he was acceptable prey, someone upon whom they could practice their cruelty without fear of reprisal. His mother tried to protect him when she could, but even her love was tinged with shame. She had borne a defective child, and in a society where such things reflected upon the entire family, she found herself gradually pushed to the margins of clan life. His father, if he was known at all, never acknowledged the twisted offspring as his own. No orcish warrior wished to claim such a legacy. The years of Gul'dan's childhood were years of unrelenting misery. He learned to read the moods of those around him, to know when violence was coming so that he might hide or at least minimize the damage. He learned which corners of the village were safest, which times of day brought the least attention, which members of the clan could be avoided, and which sought him out specifically for sport. But more than survival, Gul'dan learned to hate. He watched the other children grow strong and confident, watched them earn their names and take their places in clan society. He watched warriors return from hunts bearing trophies, heard the songs sung in their honor, saw the pride in their families' eyes. And with each passing day, the bitterness in his heart grew deeper and darker, a poison that spread through his soul until it became the very essence of who he was. The beatings came with terrible regularity. Sometimes they were random, the result of bored young orcs looking for entertainment. Other times, they were systematic, punishment for imagined slights, or simply for existing when someone else wished he did not. Gul'dan's body, already broken, was broken again and again. Bones that had healed wrong were broken anew. Skin that had barely scarred over was torn open once more. Through it all, something within him refused to die. The hatred sustained him when food was scarce and sleep was impossible. The burning desire for revenge kept his heart beating when by all rights it should have stopped. He did not pray to the spirits for deliverance or healing. He had seen how the spirits regarded him, had felt their rejection when shamans attempted to bless his twisted form. The spirits offered him nothing, and so he would offer them nothing in return. It was the clan's shaman who first recognized something unusual in the crippled outcast. This elderly orc, whose name has been lost to history along with everything else about that doomed village, observed Gul'dan from afar over the course of many years. He watched the boy endure suffering that would have broken stronger orcs. He saw the intelligence burning behind those hateful eyes, the calculating mind that never stopped working even when the body was being destroyed. One day, when Gul'dan lay bleeding in the dust after a particularly vicious beating, the shaman approached him. The old orc's shadow fell across the broken youth, and for a moment Gul'dan tensed, expecting another blow. But instead, the shaman knelt beside him and spoke words that would change everything. The shaman told Gul'dan that he saw greatness within him, not the greatness of warriors or hunters, but something different, something that the spirits themselves had placed there for reasons beyond mortal understanding. He advised the young orc to travel to the throne of the elements, the sacred place where the elemental spirits gathered and where shamans communed with forces beyond ordinary perception. There, the shaman promised, Gul'dan would find his destiny. Gul'dan's response was pure venom. He rejected the shaman's words with all the bitterness that had accumulated over his years of suffering. Why should he trust the spirits? They had cursed him from birth. Why should he seek a destiny when his own people had made clear that he deserved none? The shaman's kindness was just another form of cruelty, another way to raise his hopes before dashing them against the rocks of reality. The chieftain, witnessing this exchange, made a decision. He banished Gul'dan from the village, declaring that the crippled youth was no longer welcome among his people. It was not a punishment, but a release, a pushing away of something that had always been considered a burden. The clan would no longer be responsible for feeding and sheltering one who contributed nothing. Gul'dan left his village with nothing but the rags on his back and the hatred in his heart. He did not look back at the place where he had suffered so much. He did not mourn the loss of the only home he had ever known. The bitterness that had sustained him through all those years of torment now became his sole companion as he walked into the wilderness of Gorgrond. For months, Gul'dan wandered the harsh lands of Draenor, barely surviving on whatever scraps he could find or steal. The wilderness was no kinder to him than his village had been. Predators stalked him, recognizing in his twisted form an easy meal. Other orcs he encountered drove him away with stones and curses, wanting nothing to do with one so obviously marked by misfortune. Starvation became his constant companion. His already weakened body wasted away until he was little more than bones held together by stubborn refusal to die. He ate insects and roots, drank from stagnant pools, slept in whatever shelter he could find from the elements. The physical suffering was immense, but it was nothing compared to what he had already endured. At least in the wilderness, the pain came from nature rather than from the deliberate cruelty of his own kind. Through it all, the shaman's words echoed in his mind: the throne of the elements, a destiny waiting to be claimed. Gul'dan had rejected those words in anger, but as the months passed and his options dwindled to nothing, he found himself wondering, what if there was something waiting for him? What if the spirits could offer him what his own people never had? Eventually, driven more by desperation than faith, Gul'dan made his way to the throne of the elements. This sacred site was a place where the raw power of nature manifested in physical form, where fire and water, earth and air came together in a display of primal majesty. Shamans throughout orcish history had journeyed here to commune with the elements, to seek wisdom and power, to prove their worthiness to serve as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Gul'dan approached the sacred stones with a mixture of hope and cynicism. He had never believed in the benevolence of the spirits, had never trusted in forces beyond his own comprehension, but he had nothing left to lose. If the spirits rejected him, as he expected they would, he would simply die in this place rather than somewhere else. It made little difference. He performed the rituals as best he could, having observed shamans from afar during his years in the village. He called out to the elements, asking them to acknowledge his presence, to grant him the power that had been denied him by his own body. He opened himself to whatever forces might be listening, prepared for whatever response might come. The response was immediate and devastating. The elements recoiled from Gul'dan with something approaching horror. Fire dimmed in his presence. Water grew still and cold. Earth trembled as if trying to move away from where he stood. Air itself seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere was trying to suffocate him. The spirits had sensed the darkness within his soul, the hatred and bitterness that had become the core of his being, and they wanted nothing to do with him. Gul'dan stood before the throne of the elements, rejected by the very forces he had come to court. The shaman's promise of destiny had proven to be exactly what he had expected: empty words, false hope, another cruel joke at his expense. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, with nothing ahead of him but a slow death in the wilderness. And then something else spoke to him. The voice that whispered in Gul'dan's mind was not the voice of the elements. It was something older, darker, more powerful than anything he had ever imagined. It spoke of power beyond the comprehension of mortal shamans. It spoke of revenge against those who had wronged him. It spoke of greatness that could be his, if only he was willing to pay the price. Kil'jaeden, the deceiver, one of the most powerful beings in the cosmos, had found his new puppet. The demon lord had been observing the orcs of Draenor for some time, searching for the perfect instrument through which to work his will. He had already begun the corruption of the respected shaman Ner'zhul, but Kil'jaeden recognized that Ner'zhul's fundamental decency would eventually become a problem. He needed someone with no such moral constraints, someone whose soul was already so black that demonic influence would feel like a natural extension rather than a violation. Gul'dan was perfect. The broken orc listened to the voice in his mind with growing wonder. Here at last was something that did not recoil from his darkness, but embraced it. Here was power that did not care about the shape of his body, only the hunger in his soul. Kil'jaeden offered him everything he had ever wanted: strength, respect, revenge upon those who had tormented him. All he had to do was serve. Gul'dan did not hesitate. He had never believed in the goodness of the universe, had never trusted in forces that claimed to be benevolent. The demons offered him a simple transaction: power in exchange for service. It was honest in its corruption, straightforward in its malevolence. He understood it in a way he had never understood the supposedly benevolent spirits who had always turned their backs on him. He agreed to become Kil'jaeden's harbinger among the orcs. He would spread the demon's influence, prepare his people for the great work that was to come. In exchange, he would receive power beyond anything the shamans had ever wielded, power that would make his enemies tremble and his tormentors beg for mercy. The transformation began immediately. Fell energy, the corrupting power of the demons, flowed into Gul'dan's broken body. It did not heal his deformities, but rather embraced them, made them part of a new and terrible form. His spine remained bent, but now it was bent over secrets of unimaginable power. His limbs remained twisted, but now they could channel energies that would make the strongest warrior weep with envy. The process of becoming a warlock was not instantaneous. Over the following weeks and months, Kil'jaeden taught Gul'dan the fundamentals of fell magic, revealing to him secrets that no mortal had ever known. The demon lord showed him how to summon lesser demons, how to bind them to his will, how to drain the life force from living beings to fuel his own power. Each lesson came with a price, a piece of Gul'dan's soul traded for a piece of forbidden knowledge. Gul'dan proved to be an exceptional student. His natural intelligence, honed by years of survival against impossible odds, allowed him to grasp concepts that would have overwhelmed lesser minds. His hatred gave him focus. His bitterness gave him motivation. His hunger for revenge gave him the will to endure the pain that accompanied each new level of power. Where others might have balked at the cost, Gul'dan paid gladly. The fell energy changed him in ways both visible and invisible. His eyes began to glow with a sickly green light, the same light that marked all those who had been touched by demonic corruption. His voice took on new resonances, harmonics that came from beyond the mortal realm. His very presence became unsettling to those who encountered him, as if some part of their instincts recognized that he was no longer entirely of this world. Kil'jaeden was pleased with his new servant. In Gul'dan, he had found not just a willing tool, but an enthusiastic partner. The orc did not need to be manipulated or deceived. He understood exactly what he was doing and embraced it completely. This made him far more useful than someone like Ner'zhul, who constantly needed reassurance and careful handling. Gul'dan had become the first orcish warlock, a being of fell magic and demonic devotion. The crippled outcast had found his destiny, and that destiny was darkness. Kil'jaeden's first command to his new servant was simple and terrible. Gul'dan was to return to his village and eliminate everyone who knew of his past. The demon lord wanted no weaknesses in his instrument, no connections that might one day be used against him. More than that, He wanted Gul'dan to prove his commitment by destroying the last traces of who he had been. Gul'dan obeyed without hesitation. He returned to the village that had cast him out, but he was no longer the broken child they had tormented. He was something new, something terrible, draped in tattered robes that concealed the fell energies crackling within his twisted form. The orcs who saw him approach felt an instinctive fear, though they could not quite understand why. The chieftain recognized him first. The leader of the clan stepped forward, his voice harsh with authority, reminding Gul'dan that he had been banished, that he was not welcome here, that if he did not leave immediately, the consequences would be severe. It was the same voice that had pronounced his exile, the same contempt that had followed him throughout his childhood. Gul'dan's response was a word of power that reduced the chieftain to ash. The fell energy erupted from his outstretched hand in a torrent of green fire, consuming the chieftain so quickly that the orc did not even have time to scream. One moment there was a living, breathing being filled with authority and contempt. The next moment there was nothing but drifting cinders and the smell of burning. The village erupted into chaos. Warriors who had once beaten Gul'dan for sport now scrambled for weapons, but they were far too slow. The warlock moved through his former home like a force of nature, like the wrath of something far greater than himself. Fell fire consumed homes and bodies alike. Those who tried to flee found their paths blocked by walls of demonic energy. Those who tried to fight found their weapons melting in their hands before the magic could even touch them. Gul'dan killed them all, men and women, young and old, those who had been actively cruel and those who had merely stood by and watched. He made no distinction between the guilty and the merely complicit. In his eyes, everyone in the village had failed him, and everyone would pay the price. He found his mother hiding in the ruins of their old dwelling. She looked up at him with eyes that held neither recognition nor understanding, only terror. She had protected him when she could, had loved him in her imperfect way, had suffered for his sake. None of that mattered now. She knew who he had been, and that knowledge could not be allowed to survive. Her death was quicker than most. Perhaps some vestige of the child he had been still remembered her meager kindnesses, or perhaps Gul'dan simply did not want to waste the energy on something so insignificant. Either way, she was gone in a flash of fell fire, another connection to his past severed forever. Finally, Gul'dan came to the shaman who had first advised him to seek the throne of the elements. The old orc stood before the burning ruins of the village, watching Gul'dan approach with an expression that was difficult to read. There was no fear in his eyes, or if there was, it was buried beneath something else. Gul'dan paused before his final victim. Of everyone in the village, this shaman was the only one who had ever shown him kindness, the only one who had ever believed in his potential. It was the shaman who had set him on the path that led to this moment, who had unknowingly guided him toward the destiny that Kil'jaeden had been preparing. The warlock actually thanked the shaman. His voice was different now, touched by the harmonics of fell magic, but his words were sincere. He told the old orc that he had found his destiny, just as the shaman had promised. He acknowledged that without that advice, he would never have become what he was meant to be. Then he killed the shaman too. Gul'dan claimed the shaman's staff and a ring that the old orc had worn, trophies of his transformation from victim to victor. He left the burning village behind without looking back, the flames reflecting in his fell-touched eyes. The place of his birth, the site of all his childhood suffering, would be lost to history. No one would ever know it had existed. No one would ever know who Gul'dan had been before he became the servant of demons. That was exactly how Kil'jaeden wanted it. And now that his agent had proven his devotion, the real work could begin. Gul'dan's next task was to infiltrate the Shadow Moon clan, the most respected shamanic order among all the orcs of Draenor. The Shadow Moon were led by Ner'zhul, an elderly shaman of tremendous power and wisdom who had already attracted Kil'jaeden's attention. The demon lord was working to corrupt Ner'zhul, to use the respected elder as a tool for manipulating the orcish people. But Kil'jaeden needed someone inside the Shadow Moon to watch Ner'zhul, to report on his progress, and to take over if the old shaman proved unreliable. The Shadow Moon clan occupied a position of spiritual authority among all the orcish peoples of Draenor. Their connection to the elemental spirits was stronger than any other clans, their traditions more ancient, their rituals more powerful. Where other clans might have one or two shamans of note, the Shadow Moon had dozens, their entire culture centered around the pursuit of spiritual wisdom and the maintenance of harmony between the physical and spiritual worlds. Ner'zhul himself was a legend among his people. He had served as spiritual guide to the orcish race for decades, his wisdom sought by chieftains from every corner of Draenor. When disputes arose between clans, it was often Ner'zhul who mediated. When the elements grew angry and needed to be appeased, it was Ner'zhul who led the rituals. He was respected, revered, even loved by many who had never met him, but who knew his name and his deeds. The Shadow Moon made their home in the valley that bore their name, Shadow Moon Valley. It was a place of stark beauty, where the stars shone brighter than anywhere else on Draenor, and where the veil between worlds seemed thinnest. Shamans came from across the world to study there, to sit at the feet of Ner'zhul and his disciples, to learn the ancient ways that had been passed down through countless generations. Gul'dan understood that infiltrating such a community would require subtlety. The Shadow Moon were spiritual beings who could sense deception and darkness. If he approached them openly, they would recognize the fell taint that now saturated his soul. He would need to conceal what he had become, to wrap himself in layers of false humility and pretended devotion. Gul'dan presented himself to the Shadow Moon clan as a survivor of an ogre attack. He told a tale of destruction and loss, of being the sole survivor of a village overwhelmed by the massive creatures. His twisted body served as evidence of the suffering he had endured, and the Shadow Moon, known for their compassion toward those in need, took him in. It was a masterful deception. Gul'dan's years of abuse had taught him how to read people, how to tell them what they wanted to hear, how to make himself seem harmless and pitiable. He presented himself as a humble seeker of shamanic knowledge, a survivor who wished only to learn the ways of the spirits in honor of those who had died. Ner'zhul himself was moved by the young orc's apparent devotion and took him on as an apprentice. Gul'dan learned everything he could from Ner'zhul while secretly reporting to Kil'jaeden. He watched as the demon lord worked his manipulation on the elder shaman, appearing first as the spirit of Ner'zhul's deceased mate Rulkan, and then revealing his true nature when Ner'zhul was too deeply committed to turn back. He observed as Kil'jaeden convinced Ner'zhul that the Draenor were plotting the destruction of the orcs, that the peaceful blue-skinned people who shared Draenor with them were actually enemies who needed to be destroyed. The campaign against the Draenor began slowly, with isolated attacks on hunting parties and remote settlements. The orcs were being conditioned for war, trained to see their former neighbors as monsters rather than people. Gul'dan participated enthusiastically, using his growing mastery of full magic to devastating effect while carefully hiding the source of his power. The early attacks were presented to the orcish clans as defensive measures. The shamans, manipulated by Kil'jaeden's lies, told their people that the Draenor were planning something terrible, that the blue-skinned people who had lived peacefully alongside them for generations were secretly preparing for war. The evidence for these claims was fabricated. The prophecies that supported them were invented, but the orcs believed because they trusted their spiritual leaders. Gul'dan watched this process with a mixture of admiration and contempt. He admired the elegance of Kil'jaeden's manipulation, the way the demon lord turned the orcs' greatest strengths against them. Their trust in their shamans, their respect for spiritual authority, their warrior culture that demanded action against perceived threats, all of it was used to drive them toward war. But Gul'dan also felt contempt for his people. They were so easily deceived, so willing to believe what their leaders told them. They did not question, did not investigate, did not demand proof. They simply accepted what they were told and acted accordingly. It confirmed everything Gul'dan had always believed about the orcs. They were tools to be used, not beings to be respected. The attacks escalated over time. What began as raids on isolated parties became assaults on small settlements. Draenor, who had lived among the orcs for years, who had traded with them and sometimes even befriended them, were suddenly enemies to be destroyed. Old relationships meant nothing in the face of the manufactured hatred that the shamans were spreading. The Draenor, for their part, were bewildered by the change. They had done nothing to provoke this aggression. They had always sought peace with their orcish neighbors, had respected orcish customs and territories, had offered assistance and trade rather than conflict. They could not understand why beings they had considered friends were suddenly attacking them. Some Draenor tried to reason with the orcs, to explain that there had been no plots and no threats. They were killed for their efforts, their attempts at communication dismissed as tricks designed to lower orcish defenses. The Draenor learned too late that rational argument was useless against hatred that had been deliberately cultivated. Kil'jaeden was pleased with his servant's progress. Gul'dan was proving to be everything the demon lord had hoped for: intelligent, ruthless, and utterly without moral constraints. Where Ner'zhul required constant manipulation and reassurance, Gul'dan needed only direction. He understood the game they were playing and embraced his role in it completely. But there was a problem. Ner'zhul, despite all of Kil'jaeden's efforts, was beginning to have doubts. The elder shaman had traveled to the sacred mountain of Oshu'gun, the vessel that had brought the Draenor to Draenor millennia ago. There he had encountered the true spirits of his ancestors, including the real Rulkan, and learned that everything Kil'jaeden had told him was a lie. The Draenor were not enemies. The war being waged against them was not justified, Ner'zhul had been deceived into committing atrocities against an innocent people. Ner'zhul attempted to pull back, to stop the war before it consumed everything. He went to Kil'jaeden and confessed his doubts, hoping that somehow he could undo what had been done. It was the action of a moral being, someone who still cared about right and wrong, someone who could not simply ignore the truth when it was revealed to him. Gul'dan had witnessed this meeting. He had observed everything from the shadows, had seen his mentor's faith crumble and his resolve weaken. And when Ner'zhul confessed his doubts to Kil'jaeden, Gul'dan was there to report that he had known all along, had been watching Ner'zhul's growing reluctance, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Kil'jaeden's response was immediate. Ner'zhul was pushed aside, his power stripped away, his position as spiritual leader of the orcs given to the one who had truly earned it. Gul'dan was elevated from apprentice to master, from spy to leader, from servant to the demon lord's primary agent among the orcs. The grateful warlock wasted no time in consolidating his power. He saw that the orcs needed a new structure, one that would serve the interests of the Burning Legion while appearing to serve the interests of the Horde. He created the Shadow Council. Ner'zhul's fate after this usurpation was tragic. The elder shaman, who had been tricked into starting the war against the Draenor, was not killed, but neither was he allowed to interfere. He was kept alive as a warning to others, a broken figure who shuffled through the shadows of power without any real authority. Those who had once revered him now looked upon him with pity or contempt. The great spiritual leader had been exposed as a fool, manipulated by demons into betraying everything he believed in. In his humiliation, Ner'zhul came to understand just how thoroughly he had been used. The spirit of Rolkan that had appeared to him was no spirit at all, merely a mask worn by Kil'jaeden. The prophecies that had driven him to war were inventions. The enemies he had rallied his people against were innocent. Every atrocity committed in the name of protecting the orcs had been committed in service to the very demons who would ultimately enslave them. Ner'zhul retreated into himself, spending long hours in meditation and self-recrimination. Some whispered that he had gone mad, that the guilt of what he had done had broken his mind. Others believed he was simply biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to undo some of the damage. In truth, he was merely surviving, clinging to existence without any clear purpose, a ghost haunting the edges of a civilization he had helped to destroy. Gul'dan observed his former mentor with something approaching satisfaction. Here was proof of what weakness led to. Ner'zhul had been the most powerful shaman on Draenor, respected by all, beloved by many, and he had been brought low by nothing more than a conscience, by an inability to embrace the darkness that was necessary for true power. It confirmed everything Gul'dan had believed since his earliest years, that morality was weakness, that compassion was vulnerability, that only those willing to do anything could achieve anything. The Shadow Council was Gul'dan's masterpiece of manipulation and control. On the surface, it was a clandestine organization of advisors and power brokers, a group that operated behind the scenes to guide the Horde's actions without ever appearing to lead directly. In truth, it was the mechanism through which the Burning Legion controlled the entire orcish race. Gul'dan gathered around him the most ambitious and corruptible orcs he could find. He sought out those who hungered for power beyond what their strength or station could provide, those who were willing to trade their connection to the spirits for the raw might of fel magic. He trained them in the arts of demonology and necromancy, teaching them to call upon forces that no shaman would ever have touched. The warlocks that emerged from this training were powerful but dependent, capable of tremendous destruction but unable to practice their arts without Gul'dan's blessing. He ensured that they remained loyal through a combination of fear and necessity, knowing that any warlock who turned against him would find themselves cut off from the source of their power. Among the most important members of the Shadow Council was Cho'Gall, an ambitious ogre who possessed something rare among his kind: intelligence. The two-headed ogre had come to Draenor seeking power and had found in Gul'dan a kindred spirit. Under the warlock's tutelage, Cho'Gall became a formidable practitioner of fel magic, eventually founding the Twilight's Hammer clan as a vehicle for his own ambitions. The relationship between Gul'dan and Cho'Gall was complex. The ogre was devoted to his master, but he was also cunning enough to have his own agenda. Gul'dan recognized this and used it to his advantage, giving Cho'Gall just enough power to keep him loyal while never allowing him to become a genuine threat. The two-headed ogre would serve as Gul'dan's primary lieutenant throughout the wars to come, a powerful tool but never a true equal. Another crucial agent was Garona, a being whose very existence was a testament to Gul'dan's cruelty. She was a half-orc, half-Draenei hybrid, created through experiments that Gul'dan had conducted on prisoners of both races. Her aging had been magically accelerated, forcing her through childhood and adolescence in a fraction of the normal time. She had been tortured and conditioned, molded into a perfect spy and assassin who was utterly obedient to the Shadow Council's will. Garona was not merely trained, but programmed. Deep within her mind, Gul'dan had implanted commands that could be triggered by specific words or circumstances. She believed herself to be free, believed that she served the Shadow Council by choice, but in truth, she was a puppet whose strings could be pulled whenever her master wished. She would prove instrumental in the wars to come, carrying out assassinations and gathering intelligence with a skill that few could match. The Necrolites were another creation of the Shadow Council, practitioners of death magic who could animate corpses and drain the life force from living beings. These dark servants provided the Horde with capabilities that pure martial strength could never have achieved. They were the forerunners of the Death Knights, who would come later, explorers of the boundary between life and death, who cared nothing for the natural order. Through the Shadow Council, Gul'dan controlled the Horde without ever appearing to lead it. He needed a figurehead, someone who could inspire the warriors and represent orcish strength to the masses. He found this puppet in Blackhand, a powerful chieftain of the Blackrock clan who was ambitious enough to want power and stupid enough to think he was actually wielding it. Blackhand was officially named War Chief of the Horde, the supreme military commander of all the orcish clans. He believed that he ruled by right of conquest and strength, that the other chieftains followed him because they respected his prowess in battle. In truth, every major decision he made was guided by whispers from the Shadow Council, by advice that seemed so reasonable that he never questioned its source. Gul'dan had created a perfect system of control. The Horde believed itself to be united under Blackhand's leadership. Blackhand believed himself to be the true power in orcish society, and behind them both, pulling all the strings, the Shadow Council worked the will of the Burning Legion while accumulating power for its own purposes. The stage was set for the next phase of Kil'jaeden's plan, the complete corruption of the orcish race. The blood of Manaroth changed everything. This was not merely a corruption of individuals, but a fundamental alteration of the orcish race, a transformation that would echo through generations and worlds. Gul'dan orchestrated it all, and he understood exactly what he was doing. The war against the Draenor had been going well, but Kil'jaeden was not satisfied. The orcs were effective warriors, but they were still orcs. They tired, they feared, they sometimes questioned orders that seemed too brutal or targets that seemed too innocent. The Demon Lord wanted something more, an army that would obey without hesitation, that would fight with supernatural ferocity, that would be bound to the Burning Legion not merely by promises or threats, but by the very essence of their being. The solution was blood corruption, a technique that the Legion had used on countless worlds to create slave races and warrior castes. The blood of a pit lord, one of the most powerful demonic creatures in existence, carried within it the concentrated essence of fell magic. When consumed by a mortal being, it transformed them fundamentally, altering not just their bodies, but their souls. They became stronger, faster, more aggressive. They also became bound to the demon whose blood they had drunk, their wills subordinated to a greater power. Manaroth was a pit lord, a general of the Burning Legion, who had served Sargeras since before Azeroth was young. He was a being of immense power and malevolence, a creature of pure destruction whose blood carried the essence of demonic corruption. Kil'jaeden ordered Gul'dan to summon him to Draenor, to use his blood as the catalyst for the final stage of the orc's transformation. The summoning ritual required tremendous power. Gul'dan called upon the combined might of the Shadow Council, channeling fell energies through ancient rites that scarred the very fabric of reality. Manaroth emerged from the portal they created, a towering monstrosity of muscle and flame whose presence caused the ground to crack and the air to burn. Gul'dan had prepared a great cauldron, a vessel large enough to hold the blood that would be needed. Manaroth, under Kil'jaeden's orders, allowed his blood to be drawn, filling the cauldron with the essence of corruption. The blood glowed with an inner light, pulsing with power that promised strength beyond imagining. The orcish chieftains were gathered before the cauldron, summoned by Blackhand's authority, but truly assembled at Gul'dan's command. They were told that the blood would grant them the power to crush their enemies, to complete the destruction of the Draenor, and secure orcish dominance over Draenor forever. What they were not told was that drinking the blood would bind their souls to the Burning Legion, would sacrifice their connection to the elements in exchange for demonic servitude. Grommash Hellscream of the Warsong clan was the first to drink. He was perhaps the fiercest warrior among all the chieftains, a legend of battle whose howl could break the morale of entire armies. He approached the cauldron with the confidence of one who had never known defeat, lifted a chalice of the glowing blood, and drank deeply. The transformation was immediate and devastating. Grommash's brown skin turned green as fell corruption coursed through his veins. His eyes, once burning with the natural fire of orcish battle rage, now glowed with the sickly green of demonic influence. He threw back his head and howled, but this howl was different, touched by something that was not of Draenor, something that belonged to the demons. One by one, the other chieftains followed. They saw the power that Grommash had gained, felt the strength radiating from his transformed form, and wanted that power for themselves. They drank from the cauldron, each experiencing the same terrible transformation. Brown skin turned green, natural strength became corrupted might. The connection to the elements that had defined orcish spirituality for countless generations was severed, replaced by a link to the demonic masters who had engineered this entire catastrophe. Only a few chieftains refused the blood. Durotan of the Frostwolf clan was among them, recognizing something wrong in Gul'dan's offer, even if he could not quite identify what it was. He and his clan maintained their natural brown skin, their connection to the ancestral spirits. They would be outcasts among their own, people suspected and despised for their refusal to embrace what the others saw as a gift. Ner'zhul watched the transformation with horror, understanding now the full extent of what his corruption had set in motion. He had been the one to begin the war against the Draenor, the one who first fell to Kil'jaeden's manipulation. Now he saw where that first step had led, and he was powerless to stop it. The orcs were no longer merely his people. They were the Burning Legion's army. The genocide of the Draenor accelerated beyond anything that had come before. The corrupted orcs fell upon their blue-skinned neighbors with a ferocity that shocked even those who had fought in the earlier campaigns. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to rubble. Temples that had witnessed the prayers of countless generations were desecrated and destroyed. The Draenor, despite their advanced technology and their connection to the light, were overwhelmed by the sheer savagery of the transformed horde. The Draenor cities burned one by one. Shatrath, the most beautiful city on Draenor, was put to the torch. Its crystal spires, which had caught the light of the sun and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the surrounding lands, cracked and shattered in the heat of felfire. Its libraries, containing knowledge accumulated over millennia of exile, were reduced to ash. Its temples, where the light had been venerated since before the orcs had developed agriculture, were desecrated by demons who delighted in corrupting what had once been holy. The slaughter was systematic and total. The orcs did not merely kill those who resisted. They hunted down refugees, tracked survivors into hiding, eliminated anyone who might one day seek revenge or testify to what had been done. Women, children, the elderly, the sick, none were spared. The corrupted horde wanted not just victory, but extinction. Some Draenor were captured rather than killed, but their fate was often worse than death. They were used for magical experiments, their connection to the light making them valuable subjects for Gul'dan's research into opposing cosmic forces. They were tortured for information about Draenor technology and hidden settlements. They were sacrificed in rituals that required the suffering of the innocent. The lucky ones died quickly. The corruption that seeped from the Horde's war machine began to affect the surviving Draenor in unexpected ways. Those who were exposed to fell energies for too long found themselves transformed, their bodies twisted and their minds damaged. They became the broken Draenor who had lost their connection to the light and whose physical forms reflected their spiritual deterioration. Some went further, becoming the Lost Ones, creatures so corrupted that they could barely be recognized as having once been Draenei at all. Prophet Velen, the ancient leader of the Draenei who had fled his homeworld of Argus 25,000 years earlier to escape this very fate, gathered what survivors he could and went into hiding. He understood that Kil'jaeden had finally caught up with him, that the demon lord's revenge was being exacted through these corrupted orcs. But he also understood that fleeing again was not an option. This time, they would have to find a way to survive on a world that had become utterly hostile. The fell corruption spread beyond the orcs themselves. Draenor, the world that had been their home, began to wither and die. The lands that had once been green and fertile turned brown and barren. Rivers that had flowed clean and clear became poisoned with demonic taint. The very elements that shamans had communed with for ages withdrew from the corruption, leaving behind a dying world. The ecological collapse was gradual but inexorable. First, the smallest creatures died, the insects and the birds that depended on plants that no longer grew. Then the larger animals followed, unable to find food or water that was not contaminated. The great beasts that had roamed Draenor for millennia, the cleft hoofs and the talbuks, and the creatures that had no names because no orc had ever needed to name them, vanished one by one. The plant life withered in expanding circles around areas of heavy fell contamination. The great forests of Terakar became twisted and pale, their leaves falling without autumn, their trunks rotting from within. The grasslands of Nagrand, once the most fertile region on the planet, began to show patches of dead earth where nothing would ever grow again. The mountain valleys where clans had lived for generations became uninhabitable. The shamans who had not been corrupted could feel what was happening to their world. The elements were not merely withdrawing, they were dying. The spirits of earth and fire, air and water were being poisoned by the same corruption that had transformed the orcs. Some shamans tried to heal the damage, attempted to cleanse areas of fell taint through traditional rituals. They all failed. The corruption was too deep, too pervasive, and it was spreading faster than any natural process could counter. The irony was that the orcs were destroying their own world through their corruption. They needed Azeroth not because they had conquered Draenor, but because they were killing it. The war against the Draenei had been justified by claims that the blue-skinned people were a threat, but the real threat to orcish survival was the Afel magic that the orcs themselves had embraced. Gul'dan understood this perfectly and used it to his advantage, arguing that the Horde must find new worlds to conquer before Draenor became completely uninhabitable. Gul'dan observed all of this with satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The orcs were corrupted, the Draenei were being exterminated, and Draenor was being drained of its life force. Soon, very soon, the Horde would need a new world to conquer. And Kil'jaeden had already identified the perfect target. The contact with Medivh changed everything. The Guardian of Tirisfal, the most powerful human mage on Azeroth, had been possessed by the spirit of Sargeras since before his birth. The Dark Titan's consciousness had slumbered within Medivh for decades, gradually awakening and taking control of the Guardian's actions. Now Sargeras was ready to use his puppet to open a gateway between worlds. Medivh reached out to Gul'dan through magical means that spanned the gulf between dimensions. The warlock, deep in meditation within the halls of the Shadow Council, suddenly found himself in contact with a consciousness of immense power. This was not Kil'jaeden, whose presence Gul'dan had come to know well. This was something different, something that wore a human form, but contained the essence of a being far greater. Their first meeting was a demonstration of power. Medivh, or rather the Sargeras that controlled him, forced Gul'dan to kneel before the assembled Shadow Council. The warlock had never knelt to anyone since his transformation, had never allowed himself to appear subordinate in front of those he sought to control. This humiliation was a reminder that no matter how powerful he had become, there were still beings in the cosmos who could treat him like the crippled outcast he had once been. Gul'dan burned with rage at this treatment, but he was also intrigued. The Guardian offered him something that even Kil'jaeden had not provided, a clear path to godhood. There existed on Azeroth a tomb, Medivh explained, where the remains of Sargeras' avatar were interred. The Eye of Sargeras was there, an artifact of almost unlimited power. If Gul'dan could recover it, he would become something beyond mortal or demon, a god in truth rather than merely in aspiration. In exchange, Medivh wanted only one thing. The Horde was to invade Azeroth and conquer it for the Burning Legion. The orcs would serve as the ground forces for an assault that would eventually bring the entire world under demonic control. Gul'dan would have his power, and Sargeras would have his prize. The warlock agreed without hesitation. He did not particularly care about Kil'jaeden's agenda or the Burning Legion's cosmic goals. He cared only about himself, about the power that had been promised to him. If conquering Azeroth was the price of godhood, then Azeroth would be conquered. The construction of the Dark Portal began immediately. This would not be a simple summoning circle or a temporary rift between dimensions. It would be a permanent gateway, a door through which armies could march and worlds could be connected. The magic required was immense, far beyond what any single warlock could provide. Even the combined might of the Shadow Council would not be sufficient without careful preparation and the sacrifice of countless lives. Gul'dan had to coordinate with Medivh across the vast gulf between worlds, their minds linked by magic that neither fully understood. The Guardian provided specifications that seemed impossible, precise measurements that had to be accurate to the smallest fraction, alignments with stars that did not exist on Draenor, materials that had to be prepared in specific ways that violated every principle of conventional construction. It was engineering on a cosmic scale, architecture that defied the normal rules of space and time. The site chosen for the portal was in the heart of Tanaan Jungle, a location where the natural magical energies of Draenor were particularly strong. The jungle itself seemed to resist the corruption that the warlocks brought to it. Ancient trees that had stood for millennia withered and died within days of the construction beginning. Wildlife fled the area in unprecedented migrations, as if the animals could sense what was being built and wanted no part of it. The very air grew thick with foul taint, the once pristine atmosphere becoming poisonous to those without resistance to demonic corruption. The jungle had always been a place of primal power, where the elements gathered in concentrations that made it sacred to the shamans of old. Now that power would be twisted, corrupted, turned to purposes that the elements themselves would have rejected. Gul'dan directed the construction with obsessive attention to detail. Every stone had to be placed precisely. Every rune had to be carved exactly. The slightest error could cause the portal to collapse, potentially killing everyone involved, and certainly alerting the demon's enemies to what was being attempted. The warlock worked for days without rest, driving his followers to exhaustion and beyond, accepting nothing less than perfection. The physical structure of the portal was massive, a great archway of dark stone that rose high into the jungle canopy. The stones were brought from quarries across Draenor, each selected for its magical properties and its ability to channel fell energy. Orcs who handled the stones too long found their hands blistered and burned by the corruption that already saturated them. At the center of the archway, the portal itself would manifest, a swirling vortex of green and black energy that connected Draenor to Azeroth. But creating that vortex required power that the warlocks alone could not provide. It required sacrifice on a massive scale. Gul'dan drew upon the life force of nearly every surviving Draenei prisoner, thousands of beings whose essence was drained in an instant to power the ritual. The prisoners did not die peacefully. Their screams echoed across the dimensional barriers as their souls were torn apart to fuel the portal's creation. Gul'dan felt their agony and smiled, knowing that their suffering was purchasing his future divinity. Medivh worked from the Azeroth side, using the Guardian's access to ley lines and magical nexuses to anchor the portal on his world. Together, the possessed Guardian and the corrupted warlock tore a hole in reality, creating a passage through which the Horde could pour into a new world. The dark portal opened, and the first war began. The invasion of Azeroth unfolded according to plan, at least initially. The Horde poured through the dark portal into the black morass of the Kingdom of Stormwind, catching the humans completely off guard. The corrupted orcs, their battle rage enhanced by demonic blood, swept aside the initial defenders and established a foothold in this new world. The first orcs through the portal were scouts and pathfinders, warriors whose task was to ensure that the other side was safe for the main force. They emerged into a swamp thick with mist and heavy with humidity, a land utterly unlike anything they had known on Draenor. The air was strange, carrying scents they did not recognize. The sounds were alien, the calls of creatures that had no equivalent on their homeworld. For a moment, even the most hardened warriors felt a flicker of uncertainty about what they had done. But then they saw the verdant forests beyond the swamp, the clear streams running through fertile valleys, the abundance of life that Draenor had lost. Whatever doubts they might have had vanished in the face of what Azeroth offered. This world was worth taking. This world would sustain the Horde for generations. The human settlements near the Black Morass were small and poorly defended. The farmers and villagers who lived there had no conception of what was about to descend upon them. They had heard stories of strange creatures in the swamp, had dismissed them as tall tales told by travelers who had drunk too much. When the green-skinned warriors emerged from the mist, their axes dripping with the blood of border guards, the villagers simply could not comprehend what they were seeing. Azeroth was everything the orcs had been promised and more. Where Draenor had become a dying world, its resources depleted, and its land corrupted by fell magic, Azeroth was vibrant and alive. The forests were green, the rivers ran clear, the land was fertile beyond anything the orcs had known. It was a world worth conquering, a prize that justified every sacrifice they had made. The humans of Stormwind had never encountered anything like the Horde before. They had fought wars against neighboring kingdoms, had dealt with bandits and beasts, had even faced the occasional magical threat. But they had never imagined that an army of green-skinned monsters would pour out of a swamp and begin slaughtering everything in their path. The initial response was chaos. Local militia were overwhelmed within hours. Messengers sent to warn other settlements were intercepted and killed. By the time the kingdom's military began to mobilize, the Horde had already established a beachhead that would prove nearly impossible to dislodge. The war that followed was brutal beyond anything the humans had experienced. The orcs fought with a savagery that shocked even veteran soldiers. They did not take prisoners, except for specific purposes. They did not negotiate or parley. They simply killed and burned and moved on to the next target, their demonic bloodlust driving them ever forward. Gul'dan did not personally lead the attacks. That was Blackhand's role, and the puppet war chief performed admirably. The Shadow Council remained behind the scenes, coordinating the war effort through their control of the chieftains and their mastery of dark magic. They summoned demons to assist the Horde, raised the dead as additional soldiers, and used their spies to gather intelligence about human defenses. Garona proved particularly valuable during this period. The half-breed assassin could move among humans without immediately attracting suspicion. Her appearance exotic, but not immediately recognizable as orcish. She gathered information about human leaders, military deployments, and defensive preparations. She reported everything to the Shadow Council, providing the intelligence that allowed the Horde to anticipate and counter human strategies. But Gul'dan's attention was divided. While the war raged across Azeroth, he was consumed by his own agenda, finding the tomb of Sargeras. He spent long hours in communion with Medivh, probing the Guardian's mind for the tomb's location. The information was there, buried within Sargeras's memories, but accessing it required patience and subtlety. The breakthrough came during the assault on Kil'jaeden. The Alliance had learned of Medivh's corruption and sent forces to kill the possessed Guardian. Anduin Lothar, the supreme commander of Stormwind's forces, and Khadgar, a young mage who had been Medivh's apprentice, led the attack. Gul'dan, sensing an opportunity, plunged his consciousness into Medivh's mind at the moment of the attack, searching desperately for the tomb's location. He found it. In the final moments of Medivh's life, Gul'dan extracted the information he needed. The tomb of Sargeras lay beneath the Great Sea, sunken in the cataclysm that had destroyed the ancient Kaldorei civilization 10,000 years earlier. It was the Temple of Elune that Egwin, the previous Guardian, had converted into a prison for Sargeras's avatar after she had defeated him in combat. But the mental connection came at a cost. When Lothar's blade struck Medivh down, the psychic backlash tore through Gul'dan's consciousness. The warlock collapsed into a coma, his mind retreating from the trauma of experiencing the Guardian's death. At the same time, the magical commands buried within Garona's mind activated. She had been programmed for this moment, conditioned to assassinate at a specific trigger. The half-breed assassin, who had been working closely with the human king Lane, murdered her monarch and escaped into the chaos of war. She did not understand why she had done it, only that she had been unable to stop herself. The First War continued without Gul'dan's direct involvement. Stormwind eventually fell to the Horde, its population slaughtered or scattered, its capital reduced to ruins. The survivors fled north under Lothar's leadership, seeking refuge in the other human kingdoms. The Orcs had won their first major victory on Azeroth, but their master architect lay unconscious, and the Shadow Council's grip on the Horde was about to face its greatest challenge. The fall of Stormwind was the culmination of years of warfare. The human kingdom had resisted the Horde with everything it had, its knights and soldiers fighting desperately against the green-skinned invaders. King Lane had refused to abandon his people, had stayed in the capital even as the orcish forces closed in. His death at Garona's hands was a tragedy, but it was also a mercy. He did not live to see his city burn. The refugees who fled Stormwind took with them what little they could carry. Families were separated, children were orphaned. An entire civilization was uprooted and forced to start over in lands that had never welcomed them. Among those refugees was the young Prince Anduin, named after the legendary Anduin Lothar, who now led the survivors north. The boy who would one day become king was carried from his burning homeland in the arms of soldiers who did not know if they would survive the journey. Lothar led the survivors across the sea to Lordaeron, where he would eventually convince the human kingdoms to unite against the Horde. The alliance that emerged from this crisis would include not just humans, but dwarves, gnomes, and high elves, all recognizing that the orcish threat could not be faced alone. It was, ironically, Gul'dan's war that forged the bonds that would ultimately lead to the Horde's defeat. The months that Gul'dan spent in his coma were months of tremendous change. The Horde consolidated its control over the ruins of Stormwind, establishing a presence in the eastern kingdoms that would prove difficult to dislodge. But the war was not over. The other human kingdoms were mobilizing, and the alliance was growing stronger with each passing day. Gul'dan awoke from his coma to find that everything had changed. Orgrim Doomhammer, a warrior of the Blackrock clan who had grown suspicious of Blackhand's leadership, had launched a coup. Blackhand was dead, killed by Doomhammer in single combat. The Shadow Council had been purged, its members hunted down and executed. The warlocks who had served Gul'dan were scattered or destroyed. The coup had been swift and brutal. Doomhammer had long harbored suspicions about the true nature of orcish leadership, had noticed how Blackhand always seemed to receive advice from shadowy figures who never appeared in public. He had seen how the warlocks wielded influence far beyond what their numbers should have allowed, had observed how the chieftains who questioned Shadow Council decisions tended to suffer unfortunate accidents. When Stormwind fell and the Horde paused to consolidate its gains, Doomhammer had made his move. He challenged Blackhand to Mak Gora, the sacred duel that no chieftain could refuse without losing all honor. The combat was brief. Doomhammer was the superior warrior, his legendary hammer crushing Blackhand's skull before the puppet warchief could even mount an effective defense. With Blackhand dead, Doomhammer had turned his attention to the Shadow Council. His warriors had swept through the Horde's encampment, killing every warlock they could find. The Necrolites were slaughtered. The Fel practitioners were burned. Anyone who bore the taint of demonic magic was purged, their bodies thrown into pits and covered with quickite to prevent any possibility of resurrection. Only those warlocks who had fled fast enough escaped the slaughter. Cho'Gall and the Twilight's hammer had been on a mission when the coup began, and the two-headed ogre had been wise enough not to return when he learned what was happening. Others had simply disappeared into the chaos, abandoning their brothers to save themselves. Doomhammer stood over Gul'dan's sickbed, the Doomhammer itself still stained with the blood of those it had killed. The new warchief had questions, and he expected answers. He knew that the Shadow Council had been manipulating the Horde, had suspected for some time that Blackhand was not the true power behind the throne. Now he wanted to know everything. Gul'dan was in no position to resist. His power was diminished, his supporters were dead or fled, and Doomhammer clearly had no qualms about executing warlocks. The crippled sorcerer did what he did best. He adapted. He told Doomhammer about the Shadow Council's structure, about the warlocks who had served him, about the chieftains who had been corrupted. He provided names and locations, giving the war chief everything he needed to complete his purge. Among those he betrayed were Rend and Maim Blackhand, the sons of the slain war chief, who had been part of the Shadow Council's network. In exchange for this information, Gul'dan asked only that his life be spared and that he be allowed to prove his usefulness to the new regime. Doomhammer, practical if not merciful, agreed. The warlock could not be trusted, but he could be used. And Gul'dan had promised to create something that the Horde desperately needed, an army of the dead. The Death Knights were Gul'dan's greatest creation during the Second War. He had experimented with animating corpses before, using necrolite magic to raise fallen warriors as mindless undead soldiers. But the Death Knights were something more sophisticated, something that combined the bodies of human knights with the souls of deceased orcish warlocks. The concept had come to Gul'dan during his recovery from the coma. He had witnessed Doomhammer's purge of the warlocks, had seen the bodies of his former servants piled and burned. All that knowledge, all that power, destroyed by an orc who understood nothing of the greater forces at work. It seemed such a waste. But death, Gul'dan realized, did not have to be the end. The souls of his fallen warlocks still existed somewhere in the void, still carried the knowledge and power they had accumulated in life. If those souls could be captured, preserved, and placed into new bodies, the warlocks could continue to serve. They would be different, of course. They would be undead, bound to their new forms by necromantic magic. But they would still be warlocks, still capable of wielding the fell energies that made them so valuable. The bodies would come from the Alliance. The humans had many knights, warriors of considerable skill, who wore heavy armor and rode powerful horses. When these knights fell in battle, their bodies were often recovered by the Horde. Normally, they would be discarded or used to feed the war beasts. But Gul'dan saw a better use for them. The creation process was gruesome, even by warlock standards. Gul'dan gathered the hearts of his fallen necrolites, transforming them through ritual magic into gems of necromantic power. These gems were mounted in truncheons, focusing tools for the energies of death. The truncheons were then given to corpses of Alliance knights, their bodies animated and possessed by the spirits of warlocks who had been killed in Doomhammer's purge. The first Death Knights were powerful but unpredictable. The warlock spirits within them had their own agendas, their own resentments about having been killed and forced into new bodies. They served the Horde after a fashion, using their considerable powers against the Alliance, but they never truly answered to Gul'dan or anyone else. They were tools that could cut the hand that wielded them. While creating the Death Knights, Gul'dan was also quietly rebuilding his power base. He founded the Stormreaver clan, an organization nominally loyal to the Horde, but actually loyal only to himself. He secretly constructed a navy, ships that would be needed for the task he truly cared about, reaching the tomb of Sargeras. The Stormreaver clan was composed of those orcs who had escaped Doomhammer's purge, or who had been recruited afterward. They were a mixed group. Some were true believers in fell magic, others were opportunists seeking power, still others were simply too afraid of Gul'dan to refuse his offers. What united them was their willingness to follow the warlock rather than the war chief. Gul'dan was careful to keep the Stormreavers' true purpose hidden. Officially, they were a clan like any other, fighting in the Second War alongside their brothers. In reality, they were preparing for the day when Gul'dan would abandon the Horde entirely. The shipbuilding was conducted in secret harbors along the coast, away from the main Horde encampments. Gul'dan used magic to conceal the construction, to ensure that scouts and spies would not report what was being built. The ships were not warships in the conventional sense. They were transports, designed to carry Gul'dan and his followers across the sea to the tomb of Sargeras. Cho'Gall and the Twilight's hammer were also in on the plan. The two-headed ogre had maintained his loyalty to Gul'dan through the Purge, his own clan serving as a secondary force that could be called upon when needed. Together, the Stormreavers and the Twilight's hammer formed a substantial force, one that could accomplish Gul'dan's goals independently of the Horde. The Second War ground on, the Horde pushing north into Khaz Modan and Lordaeron, while the Alliance struggled to unite against the invasion. Doomhammer proved to be a more capable war chief than Blackhand, winning victories through tactical brilliance rather than mere savagery. The war seemed to be going well for the orcs, but Gul'dan was waiting. He knew that eventually the opportunity would come for him to pursue his true goal, and when it did, he would not let loyalty to the Horde or fear of Doomhammer stop him. The relationship between Gul'dan and Doomhammer was one of mutual necessity rather than trust. The war chief knew that Gul'dan was dangerous, knew that the warlock served his own agenda above all else. But he also knew that Gul'dan's powers were too valuable to discard. The Death Knights alone had proven their worth on numerous battlefields. The magical intelligence that the warlock provided had allowed the Horde to anticipate Alliance movements and avoid traps. Doomhammer watched Gul'dan constantly, keeping spies among the Stormreavers and requiring regular reports on the warlock's activities. He knew about the ships being built in secret harbors, though he did not know their true purpose. He suspected that Gul'dan was planning something, but he could not afford to eliminate the warlock until the war was won. Gul'dan, for his part, played the role of loyal servant with skill born from decades of deception. He attended war councils, offered advice that was actually useful, and made himself seem indispensable to the Horde's war effort. He knew that Doomhammer was watching him, and he used that surveillance to his advantage, feeding the war chief false intelligence about his true intentions while preparing for the moment when he could finally break free. The waiting was the hardest part. Gul'dan had never been patient. His entire life had been defined by hunger, by the desperate need to acquire power as quickly as possible. Sitting through endless war councils, pretending to care about strategic objectives that meant nothing to him, was torture. But he endured it, knowing that the prize at the end was worth any amount of suffering. The moment came during the siege of Lordaeron's capital city. The Horde had fought its way across the human kingdoms, winning battle after battle until they stood at the very heart of the alliance. Victory seemed within grasp. One more push, one more assault, and the war would be won. The siege of Lordaeron was the culmination of years of warfare. The Horde had crossed the Great Sea, had landed on the shores of the Eastern Kingdoms, had conquered Khaz-Modan, and pushed into the human lands. City after city had fallen. Army after army had been broken. The Alliance, despite its coalition of humans, dwarves, gnomes, and elves, had been unable to stop the orcish advance. Doomhammer had proven himself a brilliant tactician. Where Blackhand had relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, Doomhammer used strategy and cunning. He divided his enemies, exploited their weaknesses, struck where they were weakest, and retreated when they were strongest. The Horde under his command was a more efficient war machine than it had ever been under the Shadow Council's puppet. The capital city of Lordaeron was the last major stronghold of the Alliance. Its walls were thick, its defenders numerous, its importance immeasurable. If Lordaeron fell, the war would effectively be over. The remaining human kingdoms would have no choice but to surrender or be destroyed piecemeal. Doomhammer had committed everything to this siege. Every clan, every warrior, every resource the Horde possessed was focused on breaking those walls and claiming the city. The final assault was planned for dawn, a massive offensive that would overwhelm the defenders and end the war in a single day. It was the perfect moment for Gul'dan to betray everything. Taking the Stormreaver clan and the Twilight's hammer, which was still loyal to his apprentice Cho'Gall, Gul'dan abandoned the siege and sailed toward the Great Sea. He cared nothing for the Horde's victory or defeat. He cared only about the tomb of Sargeras and the power that waited within. The effect on the siege was devastating. Nearly half of Doomhammer's forces vanished overnight, sailing away to pursue a warlock's personal ambition. The assault that had been planned collapsed before it could begin. Doomhammer was forced to withdraw, to regroup, to pursue the traitor rather than press his advantage against the Alliance. He sent the Blacktooth Grin clan, led by Rend and Maim Blackhand, to hunt down Gul'dan and destroy him. The sons of the slain warchief had every reason to want the warlock dead, having been betrayed by him to Doomhammer years earlier. They pursued the Stormreaver fleet with a hatred that matched Gul'dan's own. Meanwhile, Gul'dan reached the location revealed in Medivh's dying memories. The tomb of Sargeras lay beneath the waves, sunken since the ancient cataclysm that had shattered the Kaldori Empire. Gul'dan did not have time for careful archaeology. He used Fel magic to raise the tomb from the ocean floor, creating the island that would come to be known as the Broken Shore. The raising of the tomb was itself a feat of tremendous magical power. The structure had rested on the ocean floor for 10,000 years, buried under sediment and surrounded by crushing pressure. To lift it required not just power, but precision. Gul'dan had to protect the tomb from the forces that sought to destroy it, while simultaneously dragging it toward the surface. The fell magic he employed left permanent scars on the surrounding sea. The waters around the broken shore would forever be tainted, the marine life corrupted or driven away. Ships that passed too close would find their crews afflicted by strange visions and ailments. The ocean itself seemed to recoil from what Gul'dan had done. As the tomb rose from the depths, its ancient stones still dripping with seawater, Gul'dan felt a surge of triumph. This was the place that Medivh had promised him, the repository of power that would transform him into a god. After decades of service, after the destruction of Draenor and the invasion of Azeroth, after the betrayal of the Horde and the pursuit by Doomhammer's forces, he had finally reached his destination. The structure that emerged was ancient beyond imagining, a temple built in an age when the Night Elves had worshipped the moon goddess Elune. Egwene had converted it into a prison for Sargeras's avatar, sealing it with wards meant to keep out the demons. But Gul'dan was not a native of Azeroth. The wards had been designed to repel Azerothian creatures, and the orc from Draenor could bypass them entirely. He entered the tomb with a retinue of his most loyal followers, descending into the darkness with Feel fire lighting his way. The upper levels were empty, the ancient chambers silent and still. Gul'dan pressed deeper, searching for the eye of Sargeras that would grant him the power he had sought for so long. What he found instead was horror. The upper levels of the tomb were empty, but they bore signs of what had happened here. Ancient bones lay scattered across the floors, the remains of those who had served the temple when it was still a place of worship. Tattered banners hung from the walls, their colors faded beyond recognition, their symbols obscured by centuries of decay. The air was thick with the smell of corruption, of demonic taint that had seeped into the very stones. As Gul'dan descended deeper, he began to hear sounds. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Laughter that echoed from empty chambers. Screams that started and stopped without warning, as if someone was being tortured in a nearby room that did not actually exist. His followers grew nervous. These were orcs who had seen terrible things, who had participated in the genocide of the Draenor and the destruction of countless human settlements. But the tomb unsettled them in ways that battlefield carnage never had. This was a place of ancient evil, a prison for beings that even the demons feared. Gul'dan pressed on, ignoring their concerns. He had come too far to turn back now. The eye of Sargeras was somewhere in this structure, and he would find it no matter what stood in his way. The demons that Egwene had trapped within the tomb had gone, mad over the millennia of imprisonment. They were not the disciplined servants of the Burning Legion, but ravening creatures of pure chaos, their sanity long since destroyed by isolation and suffering. When they sensed Gul'dan's presence, they attacked. The first attack came without warning. A creature that had once been a Nathrezim, a dreadlord of considerable power, dropped from the ceiling onto one of Gul'dan's followers. The orc's scream lasted only a moment before it was cut short by the sound of tearing flesh. The other orcs raised their weapons, but the dreadlord was already gone, melting into the shadows with its prey. More attacks followed. The demons had learned patience during their long imprisonment. They did not fight openly, where Gul'dan's fell magic might have destroyed them. They struck from darkness, killed quickly, and vanished before the warlock could respond. One by one, the orcs who had accompanied Gul'dan into the tomb were picked off. The warlock's followers died first, torn apart by claws and teeth and eldritch energies. The screams echoed through the ancient corridors as demons that had waited 10,000 years for prey finally found something to destroy. Gul'dan fought back with all his power, blasting demons with fell fire and dark magic, but they were too many. He pressed on alone, leaving his dead followers behind. The eye of Sargeras was close. He could feel it. If he could just reach it, all of this would be worth it. The power waiting within that artifact would make him invincible, would give him the strength to destroy these mad demons and anyone else who stood in his way. The deeper levels of the tomb were worse than anything above. Here, the mad demons had carved their own chambers into the stone, creating warrens and tunnels that defied conventional geometry. Passages twisted back on themselves. Stairs led to ceilings. Doorways opened onto solid rock. The architecture had been warped by millennia of demonic occupation, transformed into something that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. Gul'dan's fell fire provided the only illumination, and even that seemed to struggle against the darkness. The shadows here were not merely the absence of light. They were something more, something that pressed against him with almost physical weight. He could feel things moving in those shadows, watching him, waiting for the moment when his concentration would slip. The voices of the dead whispered constantly now. They were not just the warlocks he had sacrificed to reach this place. They were older voices, the spirits of those who had served in this temple when it was still dedicated to Elune, the night elves who had died when Egwene converted their sacred space into a prison. They did not understand what had happened to them. They did not know why they were trapped here with demons. They only knew that they hated, and that hatred was now focused on Gul'dan. He could feel his power draining with every step deeper into the tomb. The fell energies that had sustained him for decades seemed to bleed away into the hungry darkness. The artifacts of power that he carried grew cold and inert. Even the connection to Kil'jaeden felt distant, as if the demon lord had abandoned him to whatever fate awaited in the depths. And then he heard the laughter. It echoed through the tomb, a sound of cosmic mockery that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Gul'dan recognized the source, Sargeras himself, the Dark Titan, the master of the Burning Legion. The being whose power Gul'dan had hoped to claim was watching his attempts and finding them amusing. In that moment, Gul'dan understood the truth. He had never been pursuing his own ambition. He had always been a pawn, a tool used by powers greater than himself to accomplish their purposes. Kil'jaeden had used him to corrupt the orcs. Sargeras had used him to open the dark portal, and now the Dark Titan was watching him die, finding entertainment in the death of one who had thought himself destined for godhood. The demons fell upon Gul'dan at the very threshold of the Eye Chamber. They tore him apart, his twisted body finally destroyed after surviving so much abuse throughout his life. The warlock who had betrayed his people, murdered his clan, and damned 2 worlds died alone in darkness, his dreams of power unrealized, his life revealed as nothing more than a cosmic joke. In his final moments, Gul'dan used his own blood to write runes on the walls of the tomb. He recorded his story, his discoveries, his warnings about what lay within. It was not an act of altruism, but of spite, a final gesture of defiance against a universe that had always tormented him. Even as the demons tore into his flesh, Gul'dan's mind remained active, still calculating, still scheming. He could feel his body failing, could feel the life draining from his broken form, but some part of him refused to simply die. The runes he wrote were more than just words. They were a final magical working, a desperate attempt to preserve something of himself beyond death. The symbols glowed with a sickly green light as Gul'dan traced them, his blood serving as both ink and magical catalyst. He wrote in the language of demons, in scripts that no mortal had ever been meant to know. He poured his hatred into the words, his bitterness, his unending hunger for power. Whatever survived of him would carry that darkness forward. The last thing Gul'dan saw was the eye of Sargeras, visible through the doorway he had almost reached. The artifact of his dreams was mere feet away. The power he had sought his entire life, separated from him by nothing more than a threshold he could not cross. The irony was not lost on him. To come so close, to sacrifice so much, and to fail at the very last moment. The universe had saved its cruelest joke for last. Above the tomb, the Black-Tooth Grin clan arrived to find Gul'dan's forces already, destroyed by demons that had emerged from the structure. They slaughtered the remnants of the Storm Reaver and Twilight's Hammer clans, unaware that their primary target was already dead. The betrayal that Gul'dan had engineered cost the Horde the Second War, giving the Alliance the time it needed to regroup and ultimately defeat the orcish invasion. Gul'dan's body was destroyed, but his spirit would not rest, and his skull, imbued with all the knowledge and power he had accumulated over his terrible lifetime, would become one of the most dangerous artifacts in the history of Azeroth. The skull of Gul'dan carried within it everything that the warlock had been, his knowledge of fell magic, his memories of serving the Burning Legion, his very personality preserved in crystallized form. It became an artifact of tremendous power, sought after by those who wished to tap into the demonic forces that had defined Gul'dan's existence. The creation of such an artifact was not intentional on Gul'dan's part. His skull became a vessel for his power because of the sheer concentration of fell energy that had saturated his body over decades of demonic communion. When the demons destroyed his physical form, the magic did not dissipate, but instead crystallized around the most durable part of his remains. The skull became a focus point, a container for everything that Gul'dan had learned and everything he had become. Those who touched the skull could feel the presence within it. Gul'dan's consciousness, or at least an echo of it, remained trapped in the bone. It whispered promises of power, shared fragments of forbidden knowledge, tempted those who held it to embrace the same darkness that had consumed the warlock in life. It was simultaneously a tool and a trap, offering genuine power while drawing its users ever deeper into corruption. The skull's journey through history was marked by destruction and tragedy. Every being who wielded it found themselves changed by the experience. Some were corrupted entirely, their souls consumed by the same darkness that had claimed Gul'dan. Others used its power for their own ends, accomplishing great deeds while paying terrible prices. None emerged unchanged from contact with the artifact. Ner'zhul was the first to use the skull, The shaman who had been Gul'dan's first mentor, the one who had been pushed aside when his apprentice proved more willing to serve the demons, found himself in desperate need of power. The horde on Draenor was dying. The world itself was dying. Ner'zhul needed to open portals to other worlds, to find new places where the orcs could survive. The skull provided the power he needed. Through it, Ner'zhul accessed energies that allowed him to tear holes in reality, creating portals to worlds throughout the cosmos. But the energies he unleashed were too great for Draenor to contain. The planet shattered, its very fabric torn apart by the dimensional rifts that Ner'zhul had opened. What remained became Outland, a broken collection of fragments floating in the twisting nether. Kil'jaeden took Ner'zhul after the destruction of Draenor, transforming him into the Lich King as punishment for his earlier disobedience. But that is another story. The skull found its way to the tomb of Sargeras after Draenor's destruction. It lay in the darkness, waiting for someone else to claim its power. That someone was Illidan Stormrage. The night elf demon hunter was an ancient being, 10,000 years old, who had sacrificed everything in his war against the Burning Legion. During the War of the Ancients, when the Legion had first invaded Azeroth, Illidan had been a mage of considerable power. He had watched his people nearly destroyed by demons, had seen the horrors that the Legion inflicted upon those who resisted. Illidan had made choices during that war that his people had never forgiven. He had consumed demonic power to enhance his abilities. He had been willing to use any weapon, embrace any strategy, accept any cost in the pursuit of victory. He had been branded a traitor by those who did not understand his methods, imprisoned for 10,000 years by those who feared what he had become. When he was finally released, Illidan sought power that would allow him to destroy the Legion once and for all. He learned of the Skull of Gul'dan, understood what power it contained, and saw an opportunity. The skull held the accumulated knowledge of the most powerful warlock who had ever lived, an orc who had served the Legion for decades and learned their secrets. Illidan found the Skull of Gul'dan in Felwood, where it had been brought by agents of the Legion. He consumed its power, absorbing the warlock's accumulated knowledge and demonic energy. The transformation changed Illidan fundamentally, giving him wings and hooves, turning him into something between night elf and demon. The process was agonizing, but also exhilarating. Illidan felt Gul'dan's memories flooding into his mind, the warlock's knowledge of fell magic and demonic rituals becoming his own. He saw glimpses of Gul'dan's life, understood the bitterness and hatred that had driven the warlock, recognized the parallels between their stories. Both had been outcasts. Both had been willing to embrace darkness in pursuit of power. But where Gul'dan had served the Legion, Illidan intended to destroy it. Gul'dan's power lived on through Illidan, influencing the course of Azerothian history for years to come. The demon hunter would go on to fight against Arthas Menethil, become the Lord of Outland, and eventually play a crucial role in the defeat of the Burning Legion itself. The original Gul'dan's legacy extended far beyond his physical death. His Shadow Council would reform multiple times, continuing to serve demonic interests. His FL magic would corrupt countless orcs and other beings. His actions set in motion events that would shake the cosmos for generations. Even in death, the crippled outcast from Gorgrond continued to cast a shadow over the worlds he had touched. But Gul'dan's story did not truly end with his death in the original timeline. The complexities of time and dimensional travel would bring another version of the warlock into the story, one who had lived a similar life but would meet a different fate. The creation of the alternate timeline was itself a consequence of the power struggles that had defined Azerothian history since the Dark Portal first opened. Garrosh Hellscream, the son of Grommash, who had briefly served as war chief of the Horde in the main timeline, had been defeated and taken prisoner after his reign of terror. He was to be tried for his crimes, for the atrocities he had committed against both the Alliance and his own people. But Garrosh was not content to accept judgment. With the help of a bronze dragon named Kairos Dormu, he escaped his captors and traveled through time to an alternate version of Draenor, a world where events had not yet unfolded as they had in the main timeline. There he found his father, Grommash. There he found the orcish clans still living as they had before the corruption, and there he found an opportunity to create an army that would serve his purposes. Garrosh brought with him knowledge of the future, knowledge of what the demon blood would do to the orcs, knowledge of how Gul'dan's manipulations would lead to their enslavement. He convinced his father and the other chieftains to reject the blood when it was offered, to instead unite as the Iron Horde and conquer Azeroth through technology and martial prowess rather than demonic power. In the alternate universe created when Garrosh Hellscream traveled back through time, another Gul'dan existed. This version had the same origins, the same crippled childhood in Gorgrond, the same rejection by his clan, the same corruption by Kil'jaeden. He had founded his own Shadow Council, had manipulated his own Ner'zhul, had orchestrated the corruption of the orcs through Mannoroth's blood. The existence of this alternate Gul'dan raised profound questions about fate and choice. If the same circumstances produced the same monster in a different timeline, did that suggest that Gul'dan's corruption was somehow inevitable? Or did it simply demonstrate that Kil'jaeden's manipulation was so effective that it could work on any version of the Crippled Outcast from Gorgrond? The alternate Gul'dan had followed the same path as his original counterpart, had made the same choices at the same crossroads, had arrived at the same destination through the same journey. This parallel evolution suggested that something in Gul'dan's fundamental nature, perhaps his hatred or his hunger for power, made him uniquely susceptible to demonic corruption. Given the same starting conditions, he would always become a monster. But this time, things went differently. When Gul'dan prepared the cauldron of demon blood, when he offered it to the assembled chieftains, Grommash Hellscream did not drink. Warned by Garrosh of what the blood would mean, the Warsong chieftain rejected the offering and revealed that the Iron Horde was already prepared to fight. Mannoroth was destroyed, and Gul'dan was taken prisoner rather than elevated to power. The alternate Gul'dan spent much of the warlords of Draenor expansion imprisoned by the Iron Horde. He was humiliated, kept in chains, forced to watch as the orcs he had sought to corrupt built their war machine without demonic assistance. It was a reversal of everything his original counterpart had experienced, a timeline where his manipulations had failed. The imprisonment was agonizing, not just physically, but spiritually. Gul'dan had been on the verge of achieving everything he had worked for. The chieftains had been gathered, Mannoroth had been summoned, The blood had been prepared, and then Gromash had refused, had somehow known what the blood would do, had destroyed Manaroth and captured Gul'dan in a single devastating reversal. The Iron Horde used Gul'dan as an example, parading him before the clans to show what happened to those who served the demons. He was beaten and mocked, his magic suppressed by devices that Garrosh had brought from the main timeline. The warlock who had controlled empires was reduced to a spectacle, a warning, a joke. But even in chains, Gul'dan never stopped planning. He observed the Iron Horde's technology, studied its weaknesses, identified those who might be susceptible to corruption. He maintained his connection to Kil'jaeden through meditation and dreams, receiving instructions and encouragement from his demonic master. The demon lord assured him that this setback was temporary, that opportunity would come, that Gul'dan need only be patient and ready. But Gul'dan was patient, and Kil'jaeden was not done with him. Alliance and Horde adventurers from the main timeline came to this alternate Draenor to stop the Iron Horde. In the chaos of war, Gul'dan was freed from his imprisonment. The circumstances of his release were complex, involving both deliberate action by Legion agents and the unintended consequences of the adventurers' assault on Iron Horde positions. Either way, Gul'dan was free, and he wasted no time in resuming his work. He immediately set about doing what he did best, corrupting, manipulating, and accumulating power. The alternate Gul'dan convinced Kil'rogg Deadeye, warlord of the Bleeding Hollow clan, to drink demon blood when the Iron Horde began to falter. Kil'rogg's transformation demonstrated that demonic power was still available to those willing to take it. Other orcs followed, and the Iron Horde began to transform into the Fell Horde. Kil'rogg had always been a pragmatist. He had joined the Iron Horde because it seemed like the winning side, not because he particularly cared about Garrosh's vision of orcish supremacy. When that side began to lose, when the adventurers from Azeroth proved stronger than the Iron Horde's war machines, Kil'rogg looked for an alternative. Gul'dan offered him that alternative. The warlock promised power that could turn the tide of the war, strength that would make Kil'rogg unstoppable on the battlefield. The Bleeding Hollow chieftain had always prided himself on his foresight, on his ability to see the future. Gul'dan played to that pride, suggesting that Kil'rogg's vision would be enhanced by demonic power. The transformation was horrific but effective. Kil'rogg became a massive, monstrous fell orc, his body twisted by the demonic energies that now coursed through his veins. He fought with supernatural strength and ferocity, and for a time it seemed like the tide might turn. But the power came with a price. Kil'rogg's sanity eroded, his strategic brilliance replaced by blind rage. He became a weapon rather than a leader. Other orcs, seeing Kil'rogg's power and not understanding its cost, followed his example. Clan after clan defected from the Iron Horde to the Fell Horde, drinking the blood that Gul'dan offered. The systematic war machine that Garrosh had built was transformed into something more primitive but more terrible. Gromish Hellscream was imprisoned as Gul'dan took control of the Iron Horde's infrastructure. The warlock called forth Archimond himself, the great demon lord who had been destroyed at the World Tree during the Third War in the main timeline. But this was not the same Archimond, or perhaps it was, since demons exist outside of normal time and space. Either way, the Lord of the Burning Legion descended upon Draenor to finish what Gul'dan had started. The adventurers fought back, storming Hellfire Citadel with the help of unlikely allies. Grommash was freed and joined the battle against the very demons he had rejected years earlier. Archimond was defeated, but as the demon lord fell, he performed one final act. He hurled Gul'dan through a portal to the main timeline's Azeroth. The alternate Gul'dan had escaped the consequences of his failure on Draenor, and now he had a new world to corrupt. The events of the Legion expansion brought the alternate Gul'dan to the forefront as one of the primary villains. He arrived on Azeroth with the knowledge his original counterpart had possessed, including the location of the Tomb of Sargeras and the understanding of what had gone wrong the first time. The warlock had learned from the fate of his original self. Through his connection to the Burning Legion, he had accessed memories and knowledge from across timelines, including the detailed account of how the original Gul'dan had died. He knew about the betrayal at Lordaeron, about the raising of the tomb from the sea floor, about the mad demons that had torn his predecessor apart at the very threshold of power. This Gul'dan was determined not to repeat those mistakes. He understood that the original Gul'dan's greatest weakness had been his inability to see beyond his own ambition. The first warlock had abandoned the Horde at a crucial moment, had sacrificed the Legion's goals for personal gain, and had paid the ultimate price for that selfishness. The alternate Gul'dan would be more patient, more willing to serve the larger purpose, knowing that his own elevation would come in time. Kil'jaeden had been explicit in his instructions. The warlock was to open a gateway for the Legion to finally bring the full might of the Burning Crusade to Azeroth. The rewards for success would be beyond anything the original Gul'dan had ever imagined, but the punishment for failure would be equally severe. The alternate Gul'dan did not make the same mistakes. He understood that his original self had been too focused on personal power, too willing to abandon larger goals for individual ambition. This Gul'dan was still ambitious, still hungry for power, but he was also more patient, more willing to serve the Legion's purposes if it meant achieving his goals. He attacked the Vault of the Wardens, the prison where Illidan Stormrage's body was being kept after his death at the Black Temple. The demon hunters imprisoned there fought desperately, but Gul'dan overwhelmed the defenses and claimed Illidan's corpse. He intended to use the body as a vessel for Sargeras himself, a physical form through which the Dark Titan could enter Azeroth. The Vault of the Wardens had been thought impregnable. The Night Elf Wardens who guarded it were among the most skilled warriors in the world, dedicated to keeping the most dangerous prisoners in all of Azeroth contained. They had held Illidan himself for 10,000 years before his release. They had contained threats that would have destroyed lesser prisons. The Wardens had developed their techniques over millennia of guarding the most dangerous criminals in Night Elf history. They knew every ward, every seal, every magical barrier that protected their charges. They trained constantly, prepared for any eventuality, ready to sacrifice their lives if necessary to prevent an escape. Their leader, Maya of Shadowsong, had personally watched over Illidan for 10,000 years, her hatred for the demon hunter matched only by her dedication to duty. The prison complex extended deep into the island of the Vault, a labyrinth of cells and containment chambers designed to hold beings of varying levels of threat. Some prisoners were kept in simple cells, their powers suppressed by enchantments. Others required elaborate magical prisons, their very existence dangerous enough that multiple layers of protection were necessary. Illidan's body rested in the deepest chamber, surrounded by Naru technology that the wardens barely understood but maintained with religious devotion. But they were not prepared for what Gul'dan brought against them. The warlock attacked with demons and fell magic, with forces that bypassed the vault's conventional defenses. The wardens fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer power that Gul'dan commanded. One by one, they fell, their ancient duty ending in fire and shadow. Gul'dan found Illidan's body preserved in stasis, kept inert by Naru technology that had been installed after the demon hunter's death at the Black Temple. The warlock studied the form with interest. Here was a being who had consumed the power of his original self, who had absorbed the skull of Gul'dan and transformed into something half-demon. The irony was not lost on him. His predecessor's greatest legacy had been consumed by this night elf, and now that night elf's body would serve as a vessel for the greatest demon of all. The invasion that followed was the most devastating attack the Burning Legion had ever launched against Azeroth. Demons poured through portals across the world, striking at capital cities and military installations. The Horde and Alliance suffered tremendous casualties, including the deaths of King Varian Wrynn and Warchief Vol'jin at the Broken Shore. The Broken Shore was where everything came to a head. Gul'dan had used the Tomb of Sargeras to open a massive portal, a gateway through which the Legion could pour their forces in unprecedented numbers. The Alliance and Horde, despite their mutual distrust, recognized that this threat demanded a unified response. They assembled the largest military force since the war against the Lich King and sailed to the Broken Shore to stop the invasion at its source. The battle was catastrophic. The combined forces of Azeroth pushed forward, fighting through waves of demons with heroic determination. For a time, it seemed like they might actually succeed. They drove the Legion back, pushed toward the tomb itself, came within sight of victory. But Gul'dan had prepared for this. He had summoned reserves that even the Legion's commanders had not anticipated. Fresh waves of demons struck the Azerothian forces from multiple directions. The assault that had seemed on the verge of success suddenly became a desperate fighting retreat. King Varian Wrynn of Stormwind gave his life to ensure that the Alliance forces could escape. He was last seen fighting alone against an army of demons, his sword Charlemagne blazing with holy light as he cut down enemy after enemy. Gul'dan himself witnessed the king's final moments, and he was the one who personally ensured that Varian's body would never be recovered, destroying it with fail magic as a final insult to the Alliance. The death of Varian Wrynn was a defining moment for both factions. The king had been a symbol of Alliance strength, a warrior who had survived slavery under the orcs, amnesia, and countless battles. He had been a divisive figure at times, his aggressive stance toward the Horde causing tension even among his own people. But in death, he became a martyr, a rallying point for all who opposed the Legion. Gul'dan took particular pleasure in Varian's destruction. Here was a human king, a being who had been born into privilege and power, who had commanded armies and ruled a nation. And in the end, he died alone on the Broken Shore, his body obliterated by fell magic, his legacy reduced to ash that scattered on the wind. It was, the warlock thought, exactly what such beings deserved. The personal nature of Gul'dan's attack on Varian revealed something about the warlock's psychology. He did not need to destroy the king's body. The demons would have killed Varian regardless. But Gul'dan wanted to be the one to do it, wanted to be the hand that extinguished the life of a king. It was the same impulse that had driven him to personally kill his mother and the village shaman. The need to assert dominance over those who represented everything he had never been. Vol'jin, war chief of the Horde, was mortally wounded during the retreat. He lingered for days after the battle, long enough to name his successor and to pass on what wisdom he could. The troll shadow hunter had never sought power, had accepted the mantle of war chief only because his people needed him. His death left a void in Horde leadership that would have consequences for years to come. Gul'dan retreated to the tomb of Sargeras, the same structure his original self had raised from the sea floor. But this time, he was not there to claim power for himself. He was there to open a gateway for the Legion, to finally succeed where his predecessor had failed. The adventurers of Azeroth pursued him, fighting through the tomb and its demonic guardians. They faced the mad spirits that had killed the original Gul'dan, the corrupted essence of former defenders, and finally Gul'dan himself at the summit of the tomb. The battle was tremendous. Gul'dan channeled power directly from the twisting nether, drawing upon fell energies that transformed him into something barely recognizable as orcish. He spoke of destiny, of the Legion's inevitable victory, of the futility of resistance. He believed, truly believed, that he was winning. And then Illidan's storm rage appeared. The demon hunter had been resurrected through the efforts of the adventurers and the Naru. His soul had been returned to his body, but Gul'dan's attempt to corrupt that body had failed. Illidan was himself again, and he had a score to settle. The confrontation between Gul'dan and Illidan was the culmination of a connection that stretched across timelines. The original Gul'dan's skull had transformed Illidan into what he was. The alternate Gul'dan had tried to use Illidan's body as a vessel. Now the two beings faced each other in a battle that would determine the fate of Azeroth. The irony was not lost on either of them. Gul'dan had come to Azeroth to use Illidan's body as a vessel for Sargeras, to finally achieve the demonic apotheosis that his original self had failed to attain. Instead, he found himself facing that same body, now animated by its original owner, wielding the power that Gul'dan's predecessor had accumulated over a lifetime of service to the Legion. Illidan was everything that Gul'dan had hoped to become. He was a being of tremendous power, transformed by demonic energies into something more than mortal. He had consumed the skull of Gul'dan, had absorbed the original warlock's knowledge and power, had become a demon hunter capable of fighting the Burning Legion on its own terms. He represented the successful version of Gul'dan's ambition, proof that such transformation was possible. But Illidan had achieved this transformation through his own strength and will, not through servitude to the Legion. He had taken what he needed from the demons without becoming their slave. He had maintained his purpose even as his body changed. He was a warning to Gul'dan about what the warlock might have been if he had been stronger, wiser, less consumed by his own bitterness. The battle at the summit of the tomb of Sargeras was a clash of philosophies as much as powers. Gul'dan represented the path of servitude, of accepting demonic power in exchange for obedience. Illidan represented the path of mastery, of taking demonic power while remaining true to one's own purpose. One had served the Legion for decades, the other had fought it for millennia. Gul'dan threw everything he had at Illidan and the adventurers, but it was not enough. The warlock who had escaped his original timeline, who had corrupted an alternate Draenor, who had launched the greatest invasion in Azeroth's history, was defeated at last. In his final moments, Gul'dan experienced the same revelation his original self had experienced millennia earlier. He understood that he had never been in control, that he had always been a tool of powers greater than himself. The promises of godhood, the visions of ultimate power, they had all been lies told to a useful puppet. Illidan destroyed him, channeling the very fell power that Gul'dan's original skull had bestowed upon him. The warlock's body was annihilated, his soul consumed, his essence scattered to the void. The alternate Gul'dan was gone, destroyed more completely than his original counterpart had been. But the invasion continued. The portal to Argus was opened, and the Legion continued its assault. The defeat of Gul'dan was an important victory, but it was not the end of the war. The war against the Legion would continue across the Broken Isles and eventually to Argus itself. The adventurers who had defeated Gul'dan would face Kil'jaeden, the demon lord who had first corrupted the warlock, and destroy him as well. They would travel to the homeworld of the Eredar, the seat of the Burning Legion's power, and strike at the heart of the enemy that Gul'dan had served. In the final battle against the Legion, Illidan Stormrage would face Sargeras himself, the demon hunter who had absorbed the skull of Gul'dan, who carried within him the power of Warcraft's first warlock, would stand against the Dark Titan. And when Sargeras was finally imprisoned by the Pantheon, when the burning crusade that had threatened the cosmos for millions of years was brought to an end, Illidan would remain behind to serve as the Titan's jailer. It was a fitting conclusion to the legacy of Gul'dan. The power he had accumulated, the knowledge he had gathered, the corruption he had embraced, all of it now served to keep the master of the Burning Legion imprisoned for eternity. The warlock who had wanted to become a god was now, through Illidan, part of the prison that held the greatest demon in existence. The story of Gul'dan is ultimately a tragedy, though not in the sympathetic sense of the word. He was a being shaped by suffering into something monstrous, a victim who became a victimizer on a cosmic scale. His crippled body and tormented childhood created a soul so filled with hatred that it became the perfect vessel for demonic corruption. Understanding Gul'dan requires understanding the nature of his hatred. It was not simply anger at those who had wronged him. It was a fundamental rejection of the universe itself, a refusal to accept any world where beings like him could be born into suffering through no fault of their own. He had been cursed from the moment of his birth, twisted and broken by forces beyond his control, and his response was to curse the universe in return. The demons offered him something that the elements never had: acceptance. Kil'jaeden did not care about Gul'dan's deformities. The Burning Legion did not measure worth by physical strength or martial prowess. They cared only about power, ambition, and the willingness to serve. In that sense, they were more egalitarian than orcish society had ever been. But the demon's acceptance was a trap. They valued Gul'dan not for who he was, but for what he could do for them. When he had served his purpose, they discarded him as readily as his own people had once discarded him. The laughter of Sargeras as Gul'dan died in the tomb of Sargeras was the final proof that the warlock had never truly belonged anywhere, had never truly been valued by anyone. His tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he could have been otherwise. The shaman who advised him to seek the throne of the elements saw potential in the crippled youth. If the elements had accepted him, if he had found a place among the Shadow Moon as a genuine apprentice rather than a spy, if someone had shown him kindness before Kil'jaeden showed him power, Gul'dan might have become something different. The same intelligence and determination that made him a devastating warlock could have made him a great shaman or a wise leader. But that path was not taken. The elements rejected him, and in that rejection, they created the monster who would one day help destroy their world. He betrayed everyone he ever knew, his clan, his people, his mentor, his allies in the Shadow Council, the Horde itself. He murdered his own mother and thanked his village shaman before killing him. He sacrificed thousands of Draenor prisoners to power the Dark Portal. He abandoned the siege of Lordaeron at its crucial moment, dooming the Horde's chances of victory in the Second War. And in the end, he achieved nothing that he truly wanted. The godhood that Medivh promised him was a lie. The eye of Sargeras remained beyond his reach. He died alone in darkness, torn apart by the very demons he had served, while Sargeras laughed at his presumption. The alternate Gul'dan fared little better. He was more patient, more willing to serve the Legion's purposes, but he too was ultimately just a tool. His death at Illidan's hands was merely the removal of an instrument that had served its purpose. Yet Gul'dan's legacy persists. The orcs he corrupted still bear the marks of that corruption, their green skin a reminder of the blood of Manaroth. Even those orcs who never drank the blood themselves were affected by the corruption that saturated their world and their people. The fell taint passed from generation to generation, a visible mark of what Gul'dan had done. The green skin has become a point of identity for modern orcs. Some wear it with shame, knowing what it represents. Others have embraced it as part of who they are, refusing to be defined by the crimes of a warlock who died before most of them were born. The debate over what it means to be an orc, whether the corruption can ever be fully cleansed, continues to this day. The Death Knights he created pioneered techniques that would later be perfected by the Lich King. When Ner'zhul was transformed into the spirit that would become the Lich King, he drew upon knowledge that had originated with Gul'dan. The creation of Arthas's Death Knights, the raising of Naxxrama's, the corruption of Silvermoon, all of it can be traced back to experiments that began in the Second War. The original Death Knights, those created by Gul'dan from the bodies of human knights and the souls of Shadow Council warlocks, were a terror, unlike anything Azeroth had ever seen. They combined the martial skills of trained warriors with the dark magic of accomplished warlocks. They could fight with sword and lance while simultaneously casting spells that drained life and summoned the dead. The Alliance had no ready counter to these abominations. Teron Gorafiend was the most famous of these Death Knights, a being who would continue to haunt Azeroth long after the Second War ended. He was one of the warlock spirits that Gul'dan had placed into a human corpse, a former member of the Shadow Council who found a terrible new existence in undeath. Gorafiend would later serve Ner'zhul during the destruction of Draenor, would survive the shattering of that world, and would eventually need to be destroyed by adventurers who entered the Black Temple centuries later. The techniques that Gul'dan developed for creating Death Knights were refined and improved by his successors. Ner'zhul used similar principles when he created the second generation of Death Knights for the Scourge, though he replaced the warlock spirits with the souls of the fallen warriors themselves. Arthas Menethil and the other Death Knights of Northrend were descendants, in a sense, of Gul'dan's original experiments. The Shadow Council he founded has reformed multiple times, continuing to serve demonic interests. Each iteration has been different, with different leaders and different goals, but the essential nature has remained the same: a clandestine organization of warlocks working to advance the Burning Legion's agenda. The Council has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that its existence seems almost inevitable, as if some dark force keeps bringing it back into being. The Burning Legion's invasion of Azeroth, which he facilitated through the Dark Portal, changed the world forever. The arrival of the orcs set in motion events that would reshape the continent of the Eastern Kingdoms. Stormwind was destroyed and rebuilt. Lordaeron was devastated and eventually fell to the Scourge. Alliances that would have seemed impossible were forged in the fires of war. Perhaps that is the true tragedy, that someone so filled with hatred, so consumed by bitterness and ambition, could have such an enormous impact on the cosmos. Gul'dan wanted power for himself, but what he actually achieved was the advancement of the Burning Legion's goals. He was never the master he believed himself to be. He was always the servant, the pawn, the tool. The Crippled Outcast from Gorgrond became the most powerful warlock in history, and it gained him nothing but death. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let the tale of Gul'dan settle into the quiet spaces of your mind. His story is one of darkness and corruption, of ambition without wisdom and power without purpose. But it is also a reminder that even the most terrible beings are shaped by their circumstances, that cruelty often breeds cruelty, that the wounds we receive can determine the wounds we inflict. The parallels between Gul'dan and other characters in Warcraft lore are striking. Like Arthas Menethil, he was a being who made terrible choices in pursuit of power. Like Illidan Stormrage, he was willing to embrace darkness if it served his purposes. Like Garrosh Hellscream, he was shaped by a harsh upbringing that left him with deep psychological wounds. But where Arthas was corrupted by an external force, Gul'dan actively sought corruption. Where Illidan maintained his purpose even as he transformed, Gul'dan lost himself in the service of beings who cared nothing for him. Where Garrosh eventually found a kind of redemption through opposition to the demons, Gul'dan remained their servant to the end. These comparisons illuminate what made Gul'dan unique among Warcraft's villains. He was not seduced or manipulated in the conventional sense. He made a deliberate choice to embrace evil, knowing full well what he was doing. The demons did not trick him. They offered him a deal, and he accepted it with open eyes. That conscious choice is what makes Gul'dan truly monstrous. Arthas can be pitied for what was done to him. Illidan can be understood, even admired, for his dedication to a cause larger than himself. But Gul'dan chose power over everything else, and he chose it knowing the cost to others. The orcs of modern Azeroth have worked to overcome the legacy that Gul'dan left them. Thrall and his followers have sought to reconnect with the elemental spirits, to rebuild the shamanic traditions that the warlocks destroyed. The corruption of Manaroth's blood has been cleansed from many, though not all, of the green-skinned orcs who bear its mark. The Burning Legion itself has been defeated, its master Sargeras imprisoned by the Pantheon at the end of the Legion expansion. The demons that Gul'dan served no longer threaten the cosmos as they once did. His work, in a sense, has been undone. The imprisonment of Sargeras was the ultimate failure of everything Gul'dan had worked for. The Dark Titan, the master of the Burning Legion, the being whose power Gul'dan had sought to claim, now sits in eternal chains, maintained by the very titans whose forces Gul'dan had served. The crusade that had consumed countless worlds, that had threatened all of creation, ended not in the apocalypse that Sargeras had sought, but in his own defeat. Illidan Stormrage, the being who had consumed the skull of Gul'dan, now serves as Sargeras' jailer. The Night Elf, who had taken Gul'dan's power and turned it against the Legion, now watches over the Titan forever, ensuring that he can never again threaten the cosmos. It is a final irony that the power Gul'dan had accumulated over his lifetime now contributes to the imprisonment of the very being he had sought to emulate. The Draenor, whom Gul'dan had helped to nearly exterminate, survived and eventually thrived on Azeroth. Prophet Velen lived to see the defeat of Kil'jaeden, the demon who had hunted his people across the cosmos for 25,000 years. The genocide that Gul'dan had orchestrated failed to achieve its ultimate purpose. The orcs, whom Gul'dan had corrupted and led to war, eventually found a new identity separate from the Burning Legion. Under leaders like Thrall, they built a new horde that valued honor and community over conquest and destruction. The corruption that Gul'dan had introduced was not erased, but it was no longer the defining characteristic of orcish civilization. But the memory remains. Gul'dan is remembered as one of the great villains of Warcraft history, a figure whose name evokes betrayal and corruption. His skull became an artifact of tremendous power. His shadow falls across the stories of Ner'zhul, of Illidan, of the orcs and Draenor and humans whose lives he touched. The warlocks, who still practice their dark arts on Azeroth, are heirs to Gul'dan's legacy, whether they acknowledge it or not. The techniques of summoning and binding demons, the methods for channeling fell energy, the spells for draining life and corrupting souls, all of these can be traced back to the crippled orc who first learned them from Kil'jaeden. Some warlocks study Gul'dan's history as a warning. Others study it as an aspiration. The horde that exists today has wrestled with Gul'dan's legacy for decades. Every time the orcs have moved toward redemption, the memory of what Gul'dan did threatens to pull them back. When Garrosh Hellscream led the horde toward conquest and brutality, many saw echoes of the corruption that Gul'dan had introduced. The struggle between the orcish values of honor and the orcish capacity for destruction is, in many ways, a struggle against Gul'dan's influence. Thrall's founding of Durotar, his return to shamanism, his emphasis on living in harmony with the elements, all of this can be understood as a deliberate rejection of everything Gul'dan represented. The green-skinned orcs who honor the old ways, who seek connection with the spirits rather than dominion over them, are choosing a path that Gul'dan abandoned at the throne of the elements all those years ago. Let his tale fade now, receding into the comfortable darkness of approaching sleep. The warlock's ambitions are dust. His schemes have failed. His power has been absorbed by others or scattered to the void. What remains is only the story, a cautionary tale about the price of hatred and the limits of power. May your dreams be more peaceful than Gul'dan's life ever was. May you find in sleep the rest that he never found in waking, and may you wake refreshed, ready for whatever adventures await you in the world beyond dreams. Thank you for joining us here at World of Sleepcraft. If you enjoyed this journey through the life of Warcraft's most infamous warlock, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these tales of Azeroth for your peaceful nights. Every subscriber, every like, every comment helps bring more stories of Azeroth to those who seek peaceful slumber. Until next time, may your rest be deep and your dreams be free of demons. May the light watch over you, and may no warlock's schemes disturb your peace. Sleep well, champion.